Do you hear me, everybody? Wave if you don't. Nobody's. You don't? Gotcha. All right. So hello, everybody. My name is Piotr Suwała, and today we'll be talking about clean and hexagonal architecture. Oh, it's working. You can open Slido if you want before, so you can add millions like questions, or you can just stay with it for later. And we'll be talking about architectural patterns in open source application for templating Prince application. What is exactly the problem? Why this talk came from? So, I'm a member of the community called Hackerspace Pomorze, and in there we had like a small printer. And this printer was usually used for like creating stickers that you could just stick on your laptop, like this one here, because I always lose my laptops everywhere, even on Jack I left it. So it's very convenient to do anything with it, and it doesn't have ink because it's thermal printer. You know, every sticker you can just warm it and the color will appear. And in fact, we had application with templates. For example, if we had some event, we had another sticker. However, it was quite problematic because, this was written in Python, and we're going with like a template engine. So like every time we were clicking something, the page got re-rendered, so UX was very bad. Also, the problem with this printer was that it's using a language, its own language, and we didn't have a way to preview this language because it was quite old technology. So every time you wanted to create a new sticker, you would have to try like 30 times to get it right, like 30 wasted sticker. So again, UX was very bad. And what's most horrible for me, of course, as a programmer, when I see a function which has like 2 endpoints in it and 3 ifs, and it's doing everything, I just see it like a horror story. So I realize, all right, let's rewrite it to something that can be just nicer and can be easily maintainable with other people. So what we were doing. So we thought, okay, let's drop the code and use another type of code, which is SVG for templates. Why SVG? Because if you have any time a vector line graphic, it's in fact the code. It's XML. And templating XML is very easy. You can do it with set, you can just replace something, and it will be working. And also my approach to this, when we were creating this project, was to get more people, do it in hackathonish way, so we could meet every few weeks or something, get like random people and work with it. Because previously and normally in our job, we have to do like projects, and we meet every day. So when you are doing project with random people and you are meeting every week, you are never sure who will come. So I wanted to drop this constraint and just design the system the way that if somebody comes, I can give him a small chunk of work he can work on without understanding the whole problem. And when we are talking what I wanted and what I want, maybe let's talk about who am I, because it influences what decision has been taken later. And for now, I finally became an architect at Kinguin, so it's my first steps. You can see a small mascot here, like advertisement. And also, I'm leading domain-driven design meetup in Gdańsk. If you are visiting Gdańsk, you surely have to check it out. However, a small disclaimer here, things that I will be showing you the code, even we will be having a domain, it's not exactly a domain from DDD, so don't try to connect these two things, because it can bring you to nowhere if you do it. I love books, so like clean architecture, I went from front to back of this book, so I understand what was it really about. And I think that just reading books give you a lot of more power and a way to discuss with other people. And it also was moving my career very often. And from negative things, I was working like several years in depth-driven development. So, I was playing with Jira, and to be fair, I always wanted to refactor parts of the code, but we never had the time. So it made me like starting new projects. Small projects that I can deliver, something quite modular, that I can work for it for a few months and give some value. And I love collaborating on the projects, because with different people, usually when you are working on something, it was the only way to get something done. So I just had to get shaped into it. And what I hate is cognitive load. You have some codes when you have to put 10,000 lines of code into your head just to understand what this one line does. I hate it. So every time I pick any structure, like any architecture, I try to address it. And another thing, I don't like reinventing the wheel. So I prefer to use technologies that already have some ready-to-go solutions, even if it can be problematic later. So let's see what stack have we picked for the application. So first we are doing event storming. You know, event storming is a very great way to understand your whole domain. It's a very big thing that can allow you to understand, for example, how your enterprise is working together. However, for this project, we just used it to understand what events are there. The user created a new sticker, user wanted to print it, so we could just create quickly the UX design to relate it together. However, I knew this tool, and it was very quick just to design it together. We also picked the Kotlin to minimize the boilerplate, a better developer experience, and also I was familiar with this language. Of course, Spring Boot. There is some code with Spring, of course, because I just didn't want to invent the wheel again. If there was something easy, when there is something easy in Spring Boot, you just want to use it and not try to redo it. You can always take the framework later if you want, because the code was using correct practices. And what we also used was Spring Data Res to export endpoints to frontend as soon as possible. In this, you can just mark your repository that it should be exposed. And I did it to accrue, of course, code depth. No, I'm joking. I mean, we did it to bootstrap the development very fast, so front-end developers could already bring some value without creating so many mocks. Of course, we had Docker, so front-end devs could easily test with backend. And now we get to the most important part. So we had also clean architecture. The idea was that you would like to minimize cognitive load, but also for other developers to work on a small part of the system. And why? Because when you pick Kotlin, there is a very big probability that a lot of people that come work on your project will be front-end developers or mobile developers. However, for me, it's quite the same because mobile developers have different architectures that are working with, and I didn't want just them to need to comprehend the whole architecture of our system, so they could, for example, work only on the part that was responsible for printing. So would say, hey, this is contract, this is interface, and try to implement it. And because we had clean architecture, many small pieces, we could easily give tasks like this. And also, I have picked Hexagonal Architecture to put some structure and convention. And why would we even want any architecture? Probably even MVC pattern. For me, I don't think that this pattern is very useful right now because our views are usually on the backend as DTOs. We don't have templates, so we are in fact using mostly of the controller and the model. But we probably don't even know what is it. And for me, more understandable and useful is Hexagon. Or this picture is not exactly, when you're creating application, it's not exactly complicated like this, but Hexagon allows you, for your application, to grow into this direction. Because I know you probably had some hobby project on your own project, and you start with so great code like this, great spaghetti, and you wake up another day or after a break, and you see this. Because you totally forgot your context, and without good architecture, you are done. You won't be knowing what exactly is in this code without a structure. However, there's a very important thing. Each of these things was done to address something. Some issue, some potential problem, something that I have foreseen. And if you don't need something, please don't use it. If you are doing something really simple, or with people who can't use clean architecture or something, they don't understand it, don't push them into these things if you don't have people which will do it, for example. So let's go into the main part. That's usually people call Mięsko. So what are those practices? Let's maybe start with clean architecture. We could talk with what is solid exactly with each letter. Let's just go with more examples. So probably solid, and you are asking ourselves, you get it on every recruitment. So where is the solid 2? If solid was so great. And in fact, I would say that there is solid 2. The guy here, Robert Martin or Uncle Bob for others, created a book called Clean Architecture, when in fact he's introducing then solid, but there are 20 more chapters talking about how to create a great architecture. And what is a great architecture? It's something flexible, that if you have a new use case, new need, you can easily put your code into it. It's flexible, so you can change it when the need arises. And for me, what's very important about this book, after reading it, I didn't feel that I'm put into some shape. I felt like it's a toolbox for understanding any architecture that you will need from the point of understanding flexibility and how to create them. So we don't have time to go through the whole book from the tactical, strategical point. So let's get to some tactical and see some examples what clean architecture can give to us. So we'll focus on solid, interfaces, and factories, in fact. So let's see some code. Here we have a previewing service, which already has some trace of clean code. You see, you have this language previewing service, which is created an object, which responsibility is to generate a preview of a sticker for us. And the main functionality is just in this class. And when we want to add something more, which is not exactly the core functionality, for example, caching, by using design patterns, we can add the decorator outside of it, so it won't influence our code inside. But I think that the better argument is here. For example, when we had some internal service which was exactly responsible for just generating the image, we first started even with magic, because we have to convert SVG text into some image that could be sent to the printer. And first we were using magic, and when we realized that magic doesn't have the full subset of the SVG, we just changed this one line with another implementation, which was meeting some contract. We started to use Inkscape. And the code changed only in this place, plus, of course, the newly implemented class. Then we realized that maybe it would be nice for SVG to have a possibility to put QR codes in there. So we create another decorator, some strategy, QR code flavor, that allows us to put just QR code strings inside SVG. And code again, change only this, plus created class. So we see we are starting to combine it like a Lego bricks. That's what clean architecture is about. And later, when we realize that we need to generate more than one image, for example, you would have some word like word and generate 4 separate stickers, we realize that we need to augment our SVG a little more, and we have wrapped it in multiple SVG rendering service, which allowed us exactly to yet again extend our architecture, our application, without the changing code and breaking, for example, our unit tests. So let's see how is it done. Usually, first what you need is a contract, the interface. So our preview method was in fact taking template ID and the fields that you would like to render into your template. And here we have a simple implementation here. We are using some other service that's using to render the template into another text form. And then we are calling the function from the domain to render this text, this SVG, into the image, putting there all the dependencies. So it's a core functionality. It's quite simple and I hope understandable. And then we have this decorator, this cached previewing service. And there are dragons here, eviction of cache, anything else that is happening. And you see it's taking this interface and it will be decorating it because the preview function inside through the cache is in fact running this previewing service. And because of it, the dirty code doesn't have to residue in our core class that's responsible for our core domain. And of course, we have somewhere there a factory, something that will like combine these things together and return us the interface. And in some more graphical forms, we just see that we have like this cache previewing service that's like containing this interface, and also language previewing service, which is the core. And of course, there is some factory. I think I was using here Spring, so it's going to be in configuration, but it could be anything else but just getting it together. And as you see this photo, there are two books. You know why? Because first, it was because when I was taking this photo, I was doing it for another presentation. And it got so well, so I put it here. But another purpose is that you need to understand a little of design patterns to understand that clean architecture. So if you are like thinking about getting into clean architecture, you have at least to understand like factories, decorator strategies, because without it, it will be just a waste of time. All right, so let's go with some demos, some things that people were saying about clean architecture. I heard very often that clean architecture helps with the code reusability. And if you read the whole book, maybe there is something about it. But if solid and this thing, examples I show you, help with code reusability, I would define it more that it's like flexibility, recyclability. In this context, you know that you are using something, you can change some implementation, but clean architecture doesn't quite give you like a way to discover things. So for me, let's focus more on the recyclability. Then in this context, you can just change the implementation for something else and just put these bricks together in other order or in other way. And the whole book, whole aspect of clean architecture is about creating a flexible design and looking as late as possible so your code don't get depth-driven so early in a development, and you can understand what exactly direction you would like to go in. And just a quick citation at the end. Your software works because getting something to work once just isn't that hard. But you will never know if I have quoted it properly or not if you don't read the book. So now let's go into hexagonal architecture, or more meaningful name, ports and adapters. So small disclaimer here. First, the hexagonal architecture was talking only about the peripherals. It was talking that if you have, for example, repository, you can replace it with another implementation of it. Or if you have, like, for example, printer in here, you can replace it with some mocks and so on. And the whole application can be used, for example, not with REST controllers, but for example, with CLI, if you would like, or just like a separate service. So it allows you just to change your environment that your application is living in for testing and flexibility. However, I also went a little further and I created a little onion-like hexagonal because I also put it in application and domain. And why is that? Because in a domain, I have like a pipeline. And for example, there is like first, you render the template into SVG that's proper. Then you extract the size so you can rescale it. Then you render these images that can be already like converted into code and printed. And I wanted for each of these steps to be customizable and to have easy extension points so I can change it during the development. And the example, why was that? Because first time when I was developing it, for example, you know how I was rendering the template into SVG? In fact, I had just a mock, which was returning just the template contents. And if I wanted to list a fields, for example, for the UI, so we know what we can input, it was just one field. Then I finally changed the implementation to some functional part, which was doing it by some regexes. It took me like 5 or 10 minutes. And then when we started to get more use cases from our clients, so people who are using the application, we understood that they were accustomed to like Jinja template series, to the Jinja rendering way of doing things. So we allowed them to use this. And it took me like possibly 1 hour to get it working. So I could iterate quickly until I could understand what business needs we really have. So let's talk first about how to bake Hex, because the rules are quite simple. In this example, we are having 3 layers. So you have like a domain, business rules. There will be like application, use cases, and peripherals, so outside world connectors like controllers or repositories or even this printer. And layer knows only about layer below, and layer below exposes interfaces ports, and layer above implements these interfaces, and this all is being packed by some type of factor usually. So let's see the code. Maybe let's start from the domain, because why not? So how can we call a class that's being stored and is a template? Maybe let's call it a template. And of course, there will be field that will be containing the template called template. And then we will be getting to behaviors. So first, we can render the template into some proper SVG. And this renderer is in fact delegating all the work to external services, like this template service, and it's taking only the fields that we are putting into our template. Then we have like render template, things get a little more complicated because we want to get the dimensions, we want to rescale these dimensions so it will fit the sticker, and then finally we will be having like rendering. As you are looking on this domain, it's quite understandable what's happening here, because all the implementation details are injected outside. The most complicated things is like implementation of SVG rendered, however, is backed by an interface. And then when we have rendered image, finally, we can convert it into language that can be pushed into printer. All right, and the other layers, like these controllers and services, where are they? So let's go from the domain from render template, which is being rendered to images, and let's see where is it used. So our business case here is that we are rendering these images first for the preview. And where this preview is used in the preview controller, which is exposing some methods, so our, how it's called, browser can just access these endpoints and get images that it will show. And in here, in controller, we have only mapping, nothing more. Maybe we could have some handling for edge cases and return like HTTP codes. But it wasn't so important here. And you see, here we are only implementing things for controllers. And let's go back. We have like these preview functions, and we have, for example, here in domain, this SVG size extractor. And how is it, where is it coming from? How does it look inside? So SVG extractor implementation is something really horrible. However, this stuff is tested and it works. It just has to fulfill some contract well, and because it's encapsulated, it doesn't introduce any corruption to outside code. And of course, somewhere there will be factory that will have to do this dependency inversion and somehow put this implementation into the whole system without the internal system knowing that the implementation is even. You can see it in the diagram that, for example, when you see the domain doesn't know about outside world. The SVG size extractor implementation is being put by some factory inside this domain through the previewing service, but the whole domain only exposes the interface. The domain is very small. It doesn't know about outside world, and application doesn't know about outside peripherals. It only has to expose some interfaces that then can be put by factories. And what are like other benefits? For example, testing. You have a selective mockability. So for example, when I was playing with a Spring, I could easily test like everything with an API inside without any like environment. And you can ask me, how was I testing printing? In fact, printing was done manually, but I could easily just mock one component, and because of it, I could test the rest of it integrationally. And also for other people, quite interesting is like a structure. directory structure of the project. Many people usually ask me about this. So usually I tend to have a module, which is quite isolated piece of software that doesn't quite communicate with other modules, maybe in a small amount. And inside there we have peripherals, maybe controllers, or some adapters even, because the implementation of a repository that was used to access the database, in fact, was also implemented only there. So application can have some ports, like has port exactly for this repository adapter for this implementation. It has these application services, and also it has these adapters for a domain, like this SVG size extractor implementation. And in domain, because it's self-containing, we have like a models, and the ports, because it won't have any adapters, because everything is inside there. And let's take what people are thinking about Hexagonal. And they are usually saying that it allows you to change databases, libraries, frameworks during development. And have you tried to sell it using these words? Like, do you think that anybody knows when you will change the database or frameworks? Is it happening quite often? I don't think so. For me, using Hexagonal is more about having a great testability, speed of iteration, because you can easily mock the outside world because it's not webbed inside your application, it's not in the spaghetti. And for me, it's also a great way for reusability. At least in this architecture I have created, I can easily change the things, the implementation, in these extension points I have created in these ports, because I already know that there are places which I can easily put another object and it will work if I test it correctly. So as I said, we had like this domain. So we have there like components and paths of interaction. So if you go to the domain, you will probably understand the whole application without going to other places. And if you need to understand like why are we using this domain, you can go to application services and see there like reusable use cases, because the whole thing was a pipeline. So for example, when I was rendering template, it could be used later in our service. And it was easily like combining all these things that I was playing with the domain. And then we have peripherals, databases, controllers, the things you love the most. You go to every like Kafka presentation, or like hearing about like new Spring framework work or doing things. However, if you put in peripherals and think about it like implementation details, you can just put it outside, because the most important is like inside the whole application, how is it working. And because we have such a great separation of concerns, there is much less cognitive load on you, because everything is in the correct place and you know where to look. And in fact, you know, hexagonal architecture was created before clean architecture. But for me, hexagonal is like an implementation of clean architecture, because it is going with its principles to like look as late as possible, etc. So let's go with a quick summary. Clean architecture is like flexible and recyclable code. Hex architecture is like reusable and ordered code that we can easily test and mock. They both will reduce your cognitive load. However, use them only if needed. Don't use them for small application, and don't put them in the place when there will be like a lot of friction of using it. And what's interesting is there's a small bonus for those who, in fact, hate writing clean code, that if you put it in small containers, if you use encapsulation, you can put everything in it. Everything, as long as it's tested. So that's all. It's a long old slide, and we can go to a Slido and see what questions we have. So the first question, do you prefer to create bin explicitly with bin annotation? Why not to use automatic bin discovery? Is it about design or just matter of a taste? So as you see, I was trying to combine many things together. If you throw away Spring from it, because Spring was needed only in this customer, in this peripherals layer. Inside application, you could just throw away Spring and just create clean factories. maybe outside the entities, because if you would like to define entities without, for example, Hibernate, would have to some XML somewhere outside, but it's still possible. So because I was trying to combine these objects, you can do it by just automatic discovery, because you can have many different implementations, and you would have collisions, you would have to call somewhere primary, and when you have configuration, you can look at it like a configuration, have declarative way of understanding what depends on what and why, without all this Spring magic. Point where is presentation, and the last slide will be containing QR code to this, with all other nodes interesting. All right, and how to name your domain implementation classes properly to not fall into the implementation naming scam that just attach meaningless words to names. To be fair, when I have just one implementation, the interface is only for me to have benefits of the clean architecture, to be able to later refactor the code to use another implementation or something. So for me, first when you are using imp, it's okay. Just later when you are using different implementation, for example, here we have Inkscape rendering service, which was creating images using Inkscapes or Magic. Then we finally had some prefixes that give meanings. And first using implementation for me is okay. Is it good practice to have separate endpoints and DTOs for different external services calling our services? I think that we can later draw it on a board or something, because I would need a little clarification here. I think it's a little more complicated. And regarding QR code, how did you set up image DPA for good, better printing quality? So when we have this QR code, in fact, we are using some internal library that just can scale it depending on the size of the sticker we are using. So always we'll generate something that's accustomed to the size. And from the other side, you can always generate this QR code using SVG. So in fact, it can be also embedded in SVG. We could just create another implementation that could be either vector graphics or bitmap graphics. And okay, another thing, when to decide objects should be mutable. And for me, it's the best if you do as much as it's possible to be immutable. So usually I even do my projects, so internals are mostly immutable, because it allows you to commit less mistakes. For example, I made a mistake with the cache that I forgot that because it had internal state, something else could influence it. And because of it, I had a bug. So for me, as much as you can should be immutable. Only maybe entities should be mutable or something, because it's stored in database and it's mutable by its own definition. Is your template domain object you had entity GPA annotations? Should your domain layer not be framework agnostic? It can be framework agnostic. However, there is a lot of work to, for example, make this entity agnostic. It's possible, because you can, for example, if you're still lazy and want, for example, to use Hibernate, you can extract these annotations to XML file. Then you'll be using JPA approach to this. And it's possible to be agnostic. However, do you think that the work that you've done to make your domain agnostic is going to be returned? Are you going to gain any value from it? Because always when we see that, yeah, we can get some value of it because we want to move our code somewhere else, which won't be having Hibernate or some other persistent model, yeah, maybe, but we can always refactor it. For me, it was the easiest way to go with a domain. All right, so I think it's all. And for the QR codes, here it is. Everything is there. Even my meetup, even me. I mean, by by reference, not by containing the value, but you can just scan it and have everything you want. And of course, if you have any questions, you can contact me later, and thank you very much.